Zara, a tiny but fierce alien warrior, stepped onto Earth with a swagger. Her race was known for its combat skills, honed over centuries, and their small, agile bodies made them the most dangerous opponents in the galaxy. At only 4 feet tall, Zara was an anomaly in the vast universe, unintimidating in stature but unmatched in her skills. She had spent years training for this moment, the cultural exchange with humans. But despite all her experiences, she couldn't stop laughing when she first saw the human soldier she was assigned to work with. Jack was everything she wasn't. Towering at nearly 6 feet 5 inches with a broad, muscular build, he seemed like a walking wall of flesh. Zara stood beside him and couldn't help but crack a grin. This was the human she'd be working with? She could barely reach his chest, and yet here he was, lumbering like some kind of overgrown toddler. Zara raised an eyebrow as she sized him up. "So you're telling me," she started, her voice dripping with mockery, "this guy is the best Earth has to offer? You're barely even visible from my height." Jack glared down at her, clearly annoyed but trying to hide it behind a forced chuckle. He had heard about the alien warrior before, but seeing her in person was another matter. Her tiny frame, her confidence, she looked like someone who could easily outmaneuver him, and that made his insecurity spike. It didn't help that she was already cracking jokes about his size. "You're laughing at my size?" Jack asked with a smirk, trying to cover his unease with bravado. "Maybe you should try lifting something other than yourself for a change." Zara scoffed. "Please, I could lift you and your ego without breaking a sweat." She crossed her arms, looking up at him with an almost playful superiority. "What do you even do? Stand there and look intimidating? You don't look very stealthy to me." Jack grinned, trying to play it cool. "I've got more than just size. You might want to keep that in mind when you're running for cover, and I'm right there to save your ass." "Oh, save me, big man?" Zara chuckled. "I don't need saving. I can handle things just fine." She looked at him with a raised eyebrow, eyes narrowing with amusement. "I'm actually curious. Can you even bend down far enough to pick something up without pulling a muscle?" The jab stung, but Jack refused to give her the satisfaction of knowing it bothered him. "You may be fast, but size has its advantages. I'm built for strength, not speed." Zara laughed again, this time louder. "That's exactly the problem. You're like a walking wrecking ball. Slow and obvious." Her gaze flicked down to his feet. "I bet even your shoes have to be oversized just to fit." Jack's jaw clenched, but he kept the sarcastic grin plastered on his face. "Yeah, well, at least my feet don't make it look like I'm about to trip over myself every time I take a step." She tilted her head, taking in his broad shoulders, thick neck, and towering height. "Oh, I see. You've got all the bulk, but I don't see any brains behind those muscles." She stepped forward, looking up at him with a sly smile. "Do you even know how to fight? Or is your best move just pushing people around?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're really something, you know that? I don't think I've ever met anyone so short-sighted before." "Ha!" she shot back, rolling her eyes. "You might want to stop talking before I make a real impression." Jack raised an eyebrow, both intrigued and amused. Zara's sharp tongue and endless mockery were grating, but he couldn't help but admire her confidence. She wasn't just mocking him to get a rise out of him, she was genuinely convinced of her superiority. It was hard to ignore how both fierce and adorable she looked, her small frame standing defiantly against his towering presence. Their banter was interrupted when the officer in charge walked in. They were assigned a shared barracks for the night due to an incoming storm. Jack's face lit up with a hint of relief. It was going to be just one night, nothing serious. But Zara? Zara wasn't so sure. "I don't know if I can sleep in a place this small," she remarked, glancing at the cramped space. Her eyes flickered to Jack. "You do realize this bed isn't going to fit both of us, right? I mean, unless you want to try curling up into a tiny little ball." Jack stifled a grin, not about to let her one-up him. "Well, if it's too small for you, I guess I'll just have to make do. Don't want you to feel cramped, princess." "Oh, don't worry," Zara shot back. I'm used to small spaces. I don't need much to dominate. Jack paused for a moment. He wasn't sure whether to feel insulted or impressed by her total lack of self-consciousness. His eyes narrowed. Well, you'll find that I can handle tight situations better than you think. Zara crossed her arms again, sizing him up with a challenging look. Is that so? Maybe we'll see if you can fit into my world. A few awkward moments passed as they continued to bicker and banter, the tension between them palpable. Neither of them was quite sure whether it was a game of dominance or an actual test of skill. What Jack didn't expect, though, was how quickly their interaction had started to blur lines between annoyance and attraction. The barracks were small, like a tiny dorm room with just one bed. Jack, unsure whether it was even worth arguing about, settled into the bed, only to realize it wasn't exactly going to work for two people. Zara stood by, watching him with a slightly raised brow, clearly unimpressed. You're taking the bed? She asked, amused. Jack rolled his eyes. Look, I'm the big one, right? I get the bed. She shot him a look of feigned outrage. What's next? You're going to make me sleep on the floor just because I'm smaller? Jack smirked. Well, it's not like you can't handle it. Right? Zara's eyes narrowed. Oh, I'll handle it. But I'm warning you, big guy, I don't mind taking over. She was still smiling, but there was a gleam in her eyes, challenging, yet almost playful. The back and forth continued, each trying to one-up the other. But in the midst of it all, there was an undeniable chemistry, an electric tension growing between them. Every word they exchanged, every joke, every sharp retort seemed to bring them closer to something neither of them wanted to admit. As the hours wore on and the storm raged outside, they eventually settled into a tense silence, neither fully relaxed but both unable to ignore the growing attraction. Zara, despite her tiny frame, seemed unfazed by the proximity, while Jack found himself unusually self-conscious, his thoughts racing in every direction. I guess we'll see if you can handle being stuck with me for the night, Zara said, her voice quiet but laced with a teasing edge. Jack looked at her, a playful glint in his eye. I'm more than capable of handling anything you throw at me. She leaned back against the wall, a wicked grin on her face. We'll see about that. The storm outside howled with unrelenting fury, the wind slamming against the walls of the barracks. Inside, the air was thick with tension, and neither Zara nor Jack seemed particularly comfortable with the situation. Jack, of course, was still trying to maintain some semblance of control, but Zara's teasing had left him feeling more flustered than he'd care to admit. So, Jack began, breaking the silence. You're telling me this is normal for your people? You just laugh at everything? Zara smirked, leaning back against the wall with an air of casual superiority. Laughing at my enemies is part of the process. It's not just mockery, Jack. It's a strategy. It's about making them feel small so they underestimate me. She paused, her eyes flicking over him. Kind of like I'm doing to you right now. Jack couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. Yeah, I noticed. You've got that whole small but mighty thing going for you. But you're right, that works, until you get into actual combat. And I'm pretty sure I can handle you in that department. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Is that so? I'd like to see you try, big guy. You might be able to outmuscle me, but I can outmaneuver you any day. Jack's grin widened. Yeah, well, I'm not exactly slow. Maybe not as fast as you, but I've got a few tricks of my own. Zara let out a mocking laugh, clearly dismissive of his claim. Sure. You keep telling yourself that. Just don't expect me to rescue you when you trip over your own feet. Jack rolled his eyes, leaning back in his seat. I don't need rescuing, I can take care of myself. But it's nice to know you're already offering to help. She gave him a sly look. Help? I think you're confusing me with someone who'd be willing to actually save you. I'm here for the competition, not for babysitting. Fair enough, Jack replied, matching her intensity. But we'll see how long that cocky attitude holds up when it gets real. Zara shifted slightly, crossing her arms over her chest. I'm not scared of you, Jack. I can take care of myself, no matter how big you are. There was a brief silence before Jack's gaze softened slightly. I know you can. But I've got my strengths too. You might be fast, but I've got more endurance than you think. Zara let out a sigh. Endurance doesn't mean anything if you can't land a hit. She gave him a wry smile, looking him up and down. I mean, you're built like a brick wall, but a wall doesn't fight back. It just gets knocked down. Jack laughed at that. You're right, but if it comes to it, I'd rather be a wall than a door. At least you can't just push me over. She gave a half smile, clearly entertained by the conversation. True. But can you keep up with me when it counts? The banter continued, but now there was something more to it. Zara was still pushing his buttons, teasing him with her usual sharpness, but there was a flicker of respect in her eyes now. She was no longer just mocking him for his size, she was beginning to see that there might be more to Jack than just his physicality. Jack, for his part, found himself more intrigued by Zara than he expected. There was a sharpness to her wit, a cunning that went beyond her size, and it was starting to get under his skin in a way he wasn't prepared for. Every time she mocked him or pushed his buttons, he found himself more drawn to her, both annoyed and fascinated by her confidence. The storm outside continued to rage, and with each passing hour, the closeness between them grew more tangible. The cramped barracks, once a mere inconvenience, now felt like a pressure cooker, amplifying the tension between them. Zara shifted uncomfortably, glancing over at Jack. You know, I'm not exactly thrilled to be stuck here with you. I don't need anyone to keep me company. Jack chuckled. Oh, don't worry, I'm sure you can handle the solitude just fine. But I thought we were supposed to be partners for this exchange thing, right? Maybe we should actually try to make the best of it instead of just hating each other. Zara shot him a look, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. You're really trying to make peace with me? What happened to all that big, tough talk about how you're better than me? Jack shrugged. Maybe I'm realizing that size isn't everything. You're a hell of a fighter, Zara. Maybe I could learn a thing or two from you. Zara raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You want me to teach you something? Like how to actually be useful in a fight? Maybe, Jack said with a grin. Maybe you're the one who could stand to learn a bit about how to take a punch. You know, with that tiny frame of yours, I bet you've never had to take a hit from someone my size. Zara let out a snort. You're funny, Jack. You keep thinking that, and maybe one day you'll realize you're not as tough as you think. You're just big and slow. Jack's grin widened, but this time there was something else there, something deeper than just playfulness. Maybe. But I've got enough endurance to outlast anyone. Even you. Her gaze softened slightly, a look of quiet acknowledgement passing over her face. Endurance might count for something after all. There was a brief silence before Zara spoke again, this time more seriously. You know, Jack, I didn't mean to make fun of you all the time. It's just, I don't know, I think I'm always trying to prove something. Maybe I'm just a little too used to being underestimated. Jack nodded, sensing the vulnerability in her words. I get it. I mean, I'm no stranger to people thinking they've got me figured out because of my size. But I'm more than just muscle. And so are you. Zara seemed to consider that for a moment before giving a small, reluctant smile. You're not as insufferable as I thought. Jack smirked. Likewise. The air between them was different now, lighter, less competitive, and more understanding. It wasn't exactly friendship yet, but it was the beginning of something else. Something deeper than just teasing or mocking each other. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different after all. The storm raged on outside, but inside the barracks, the tension was beginning to shift. They were still two very different people, two very different species, in fact, but the space between them was closing, little by little. And for the first time that night, either of them felt the need to prove anything. Zara leaned back against the wall, letting out a sigh. All right. I guess I'll admit it, maybe you're not completely useless. Jack chuckled, his voice low and playful. I'll take that as a compliment. Zara gave him a sideways glance. You should. You might never hear it again. Jack smiled, feeling a little lighter. Yeah, well, I'll take what I can get. And for the first time, they both settled into the quiet. No more taunts, no more jokes. Just two people, caught in a storm, beginning to understand each other a little better. The night stretched on, the storm outside a constant reminder of the circumstances they found themselves in. As the wind howled through the narrow walls of the barracks, Zara and Jack found themselves in an awkward silence, their previous banter fading into the background. The tension between them was no longer born of mockery, but of something else, something less tangible, more complicated. Zara sat across from Jack, her eyes flicking over to him every so often, the playfulness from earlier now replaced by something more thoughtful. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to someone like Jack, not just because of his size, but because of how he carried himself. Despite all the teasing, despite her own initial thoughts of superiority, she had to admit, he was unlike anyone she'd encountered. So, Jack said, breaking the silence again, his voice a little softer than before. You've been in a lot of battles, huh? Zara looked at him, catching the sincerity in his tone. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I've fought in more battles than I care to count. My people, we're always at war. It's in our blood. Her voice grew quieter, more contemplative. I was trained to kill, to be the best. That's all I knew. Jack studied her, seeing something vulnerable flicker in her eyes. For all her bravado, for all the sharpness in her words, there was a depth to her he hadn't noticed before. And now? What do you want? Zara let out a breath, clearly not expecting that question. She wasn't sure how to answer. She had never really thought about it. I don't know. I guess I never really had the time to think about anything else. Fighting, it's just what I do. It's who I am. Jack nodded slowly, a small understanding in his eyes. I get it. I've spent most of my life focused on being strong, being capable. But sometimes you wonder if that's all there is. If that's the only thing that matters. For a moment, Zara was silent, digesting his words. There was a part of her that wanted to scoff at the idea of vulnerability. But another part, one she wasn't quite ready to admit, recognized the truth in what he was saying. Yeah, she finally muttered. Sometimes it feels like that's all we have. Jack leaned back, the muscles in his arms tensing as he stretched. I guess it's hard, being seen as just one thing. You ever get tired of it? Zara met his gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. I used to. But I got used to it. Being small, being underestimated. But at least I'm still something. You know? Jack grinned, sensing where this was going. Well, I'm something too. But you know what? I think I'm a little more than just my size. I've got more going for me than just being a big guy. Zara raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What else have you got? Jack's grin widened, the banter returning. I've got stamina. Endurance. And I'm surprisingly agile for someone my size. He looked at her with a playful smirk. And I've got a pretty good sense of humor. Zara snorted, shaking her head. Yeah, sure. You're real funny. I'm serious. Jack pressed, leaning in slightly. I've got heart too. That counts for a lot more than size or strength. You think I'd have made it this far just by being big? Zara tilted her head, intrigued despite herself. I don't know. I've seen a lot of people get by on just muscle. Yeah, Jack replied. But that's only good for so long. Eventually, you need something else to keep you going. Zara paused, considering his words. It was a thought she hadn't entertained much, about the kind of person she was beyond her skills, beyond her strength. But Jack had a way of making her think about things she normally avoided. And as much as she hated to admit it, there was something about him that made her question the armor she'd built around herself. She broke the silence with a light chuckle, trying to steer the conversation back to something less serious. Well, at least you're not as unbearable as I thought. You actually have a brain in that big head of yours. Jack grinned, taking the bait. I told you, I'm more than just a pretty face. Zara rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the smile that tugged at her lips. Well, you're also more than just a punching bag, I'll give you that. The mood lightened again, but this time, there was an undercurrent of something else between them. The teasing was no longer as harsh, no longer a defense mechanism. Instead, it felt more like a form of connection, two people who had found something in common in the most unexpected of ways. As the night wore on, they both became more comfortable with the silence between them. The storm outside had died down, and with it, so too did the frantic energy of their earlier conversation. The dynamic between them had shifted again, but this time, it was different. There was less distance between them now, both physically and emotionally. Jack stood up to stretch, his body a stark contrast to Zara's small frame. "All right," he said, grinning as he looked down at her. "We've done enough talking for one night. I think it's time we get some sleep." Zara raised an eyebrow. "Sleep, huh? You're not thinking about cuddling, are you?" Jack laughed at that. "Cuddling? No. But if you want to be the little spoon, I'm sure I could accommodate you." Zara snorted. "I'm not that small. I'm just more compact." Jack smirked. "Compact, huh? That's one way to put it." Zara gave him a playful shove. "Don't make me regret this whole exchange program thing." "Oh, believe me," Jack replied, his grin widening. "You'll have plenty of time to regret it tomorrow." They both settled into their respective spots on the floor, the tension between them still simmering, but no longer as sharp. It was more comfortable now, less about proving something and more about understanding each other. Neither of them was sure where this was going, but for the first time that night, it didn't feel like they had to figure it out right away. As Jack closed his eyes, he couldn't help but smile. Zara was unlike anyone he'd ever met, fierce, funny, and more than a little unpredictable. But in the quiet of the barracks, as the world outside seemed to calm, he realized that maybe that unpredictability was exactly what he needed. Zara, on the other hand, lay there with her arms crossed behind her head, staring at the ceiling. Despite herself, she felt a strange sense of comfort in the closeness. Jack wasn't what she expected. He wasn't just some big, slow human with no depth. There was something in him, something she hadn't anticipated, and she wasn't sure what to make of it yet. But for now, she allowed herself to rest, the storm finally over, and the night stretching out ahead. The morning light filtered through the small windows of the barracks, casting a soft glow across the room. Jack was already awake, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard floor, but his mind was buzzing with thoughts of the night before. He had thought the teasing, the banter, would have ended when the storm passed. But something had changed between him and Zara, something he couldn't quite place, but it was there. The way she looked at him, the way their words had started to feel less like competition and more like conversation. Zara stirred beside him, letting out a soft groan as she pushed herself up. She didn't speak right away, but Jack could feel her presence shifting beside him. The silence stretched between them before she broke it. "So, what's the plan now?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm. There was no mocking, no sharp edge, just curiosity. Jack stretched his arms over his head, his muscles protesting as he did. "Well, seeing as we're stuck here for the moment, we could do what we came here to do. We could train." Zara turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. "Training, huh? You're not still thinking you can teach me a thing or two, are you?" Jack smirked. "I wouldn't be so cocky if I were you. You're not the only one who knows how to fight." Zara laughed softly, a genuine, low sound that surprised him. "I never said I was the only one. But I am better." "Prove it," Jack said, half serious, half joking, but the challenge hung in the air between them. He was surprised by how much he enjoyed their back and forth, how it pushed him to be better, to match her intensity. And how, despite everything, he wasn't afraid of her. She narrowed her eyes at him, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I'll prove it. But don't say I didn't warn you." The competitive edge returned in an instant, but this time, it was different. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. They weren't just trying to outdo one another for the sake of pride, there was respect behind it. Even if they were still both convinced they could outmatch the other, there was a level of admiration now that hadn't been there before. Zara stood, stretching her limbs and cracking her neck in a way that made Jack's eyes widen. All right, let's see what you've got, big guy. Jack got to his feet, rolling his shoulders. Don't say I didn't warn you. They squared off, either of them making a move immediately. The energy between them was charged, a palpable tension in the air as they sized each other up. Jack could feel his heart rate quickening, a mix of excitement and anticipation building in his chest. He'd fought against all kinds of opponents, trained for years, battled on various terrains, against every kind of weapon, alien and human alike. But something about this, about facing Zara, felt different. She was smaller, sure, but there was a ferocity in her eyes that made him think twice about underestimating her. It wasn't just her skill, it was the way she carried herself, the quiet confidence that had grown overnight. She wasn't the same person who had walked into this barracks the day before, ready to mock him for his size. No, now, there was an understanding between them. They were equals in a way, both fiercely proud, both full of stubbornness and strength. All right, here we go, Jack muttered, stepping forward. Zara didn't wait for him to finish his sentence. She moved with lightning speed, aiming a quick jab to his chest. Jack barely had time to react, but he managed to shift just enough to absorb the impact without losing his balance. She was fast, faster than he expected, and that speed caught him off guard for a moment. Not bad, Jack said, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he regained his stance. Zara smirked, her eyes flashing with amusement. You're going to need more than that. Jack charged forward this time, intending to catch her off guard with his strength. But Zara was already anticipating his move, sidestepping him with a speed that left him grasping at air. She came in with a knee to his side, a precise strike that made him grunt in pain. Damn! Jack muttered under his breath, backing up to reassess his approach. See? Zara said, eyes gleaming with amusement. You're big, but you're not invincible. Yeah, Jack replied, laughing despite himself. I'm just getting warmed up. For the next few minutes, they continued, each testing the other, pushing their limits, playing off their strengths. The movement was a blur, Zara darting around him, her agility making her a difficult target, while Jack tried to use his size and strength to corner her. It was a strange dance, one that neither of them was really prepared for, but they were both surprisingly well matched. Jack's chest was heaving now, his muscles burning from the effort. He'd expected Zara to be good, but the way she moved, how she combined speed and strength, was something he hadn't anticipated. And she was good, damn good. But it wasn't just the fight that had him invested anymore. It was the way their banter had turned into something else, something more intimate, more real. Zara, for all her skill, was also breathing hard now. She had underestimated Jack, or maybe she had just forgotten how relentless he could be. But she was enjoying this, she was enjoying him, in a way she hadn't expected. The challenge was invigorating, yes, but so was the strange feeling of being seen, of not just being valued for her strength, but for everything else she had to offer. You're pretty good, she said between breaths, her grin widening. Jack smirked, eyes gleaming with determination. You're not so bad yourself. For a moment, there was a pause in the fighting, and they stood facing each other, both breathing heavily. The competitive edge between them hadn't vanished, but it had softened. Now, it was more like a mutual understanding, an acknowledgement that neither of them had anything left to prove. I think we've both had enough for now, Zara said, wiping sweat from her forehead. You're still too slow for me, though. Jack chuckled, offering her a hand. Yeah, maybe. But I'm not giving up. Zara took his hand, a flicker of something passing between them that neither of them could fully name. It wasn't just respect, though that was part of it. It wasn't just the challenge, though that was certainly there, too. It was something else, a shift, something that neither of them had expected, but something they both felt. Well, looks like we're not that different after all, she said, still holding his hand. Jack's grin softened, his eyes locking with hers. Yeah, I guess we're not. There was something in that exchange, something that told them both they had moved beyond just the fight, beyond the bickering and teasing. They had reached a point where their rivalry had become something else, something more complex, more intimate. There were no words to explain it, but neither of them felt the need to say anything. They both understood. For a long moment, they just stood there, their hands still clasped together, breathing in unison. The storm outside was over, and so, it seemed, was the storm inside them. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice low. "You know, this might actually be fun." Zara smiled, the corner of her mouth curling up into a grin. "Don't get used to it." Jack let out a small laugh. "I think I could get used to this." For the first time, there was a sense of calm between them. They were no longer just soldiers from different worlds, trying to one-up each other. They were two people who, despite all their differences, had found something they could both understand.